As promised, here we have the test that you have in Juno. It's meant as a formative assessment, which means it's just meant to give you some idea of where you're at in your understanding. So the first question was, which group of genes specifies the identities of individual body segments? And if you remember our discussion, if you've watched the videos and you've thought about it and tried to do some of the workbook problems, you'll know that it's the Hox genes that deals with the segments, individual segments in vertebrates and invertebrates, a very conserved region of developmental control that occurs through various levels of the evolutionary ladder. I hate to call it that because it's not really a ladder. It's through all the various taxa. You see that this region of Hox genes, this method of control of development of multicellular organisms, is repeated over and over again. It is, in fact, conserved. The next question was, again, if you have any further details, please watch the videos on the Hox genes. Go back and look at the workbook questions on Hox genes. If the HMS Beagle, remember that was the ship that Darwin traveled on as a naturalist, had completely bypassed the Galapagos Islands. Now remember, the thing about the Galapagos Islands, as we discussed in island biogeography, is that the Galapagos Islands are far away from the mainland. There's a lot of diversity and a lot of niches being filled by various species or taxa that have changed over time. And so it started to give the idea to Darwin that maybe there's this process that he eventually called evolution, right? That eventually started to be called descent with modification, right? So where you're inheriting things, but you tweak it a little bit. Again, what's the source of that tweaking? Genetic mutation. So Darwin would have had a much poor understanding of what if he had not stopped in the Galapagos Islands. The first answer was relative stability and well-adapted population numbers over many generations. Well, if there was relative stability, then you wouldn't be able to look at descent with modification. There would be no modification. You might have the descent, but no modification. So there wouldn't be any of that idea that Darwin was inspired by, the idea of change over time. Would seem to disagree with that, would seem to counteract or contradict what Darwin, what the Galapagos Islands gave to Darwin. Galapagos Islands gave to Darwin the ability to see the changes over time in different populations on different islands in the island chain in different niches. Ability of populations to undergo modification as they adapt to a particular environment. Now that sounds like the right answer. But as with any multiple choice question, I encourage you to look at all the answers and make sure you understand, at the very least, what the best answer is, the best answer to your knowledge. But certainly, often you can identify where answers are wrong and where they're right. So please try to do that with every question set you come across as practice for those big exams that you'll face soon enough. The tendency of organisms to produce the exact number of offspring that the environment can support. Well, as you will learn soon, that is not the case. In fact, organisms tend to produce more offspring than an environment can support, and that is what results in natural selection. As you overproduce, the best fit will survive. D, unlimited resources that support population growth in most natural environments. This doesn't exist, and it certainly would not have existed in the Galapagos Islands. Now, it does exist for a short period of time until the populations become so large that they start to eat up the natural resources or even pollute the resources they do have. And no matter what, the larger the population, the bigger the problem the population has for survival over the long run. So in the short term, often when an organism first reaches a brand new environment, there seems to be virtually unlimited resources. But as the populations grow, those resources shrink. Lack of genetic variation among all members of the population. Now, again, everyone should understand that is a fairly wrong answer, and if it flies in all four of these other answers, fly in the face of everything we've been talking about for the last month, for the last 6 weeks. 3, the tree's horizontal axis is a timeline that... now this is talking about this tree here. This is talking about... I don't know if you remember when you did the question, but you would have been looking at this tree. And it says that this tree's horizontal axis is a timeline that extends from 100,000 years ago, as you can see here on the chart, 100,000 years ago to present. So everything here is alive. So think about what that means. Everything here is a go. When you are walking around the earth, you should be able to identify everything that's in this line. And granted, it's not that straight, but so if this is 100,000 years ago, maybe this would be 50,000 years ago. This would be 75,000. This would be 25,000. So this would be what, a few thousand, maybe 10,000 years ago. I don't know if this is 50,000 years, maybe this is 20,000 years ago. Whatever the case, Z is pretty far back, and V is even further back, and W is even further back, and Y is even further back, and X is the furthest back, all the way back to 100,000 years. I hope you can read that chart in that way. Simply, where did I get that? Simply from this first sentence, that the tree is a timeline of 100,000 years ago to present. The vertical axis represents nothing in particular, so there's nothing really on the vertical axis to concern yourself with. It's necessary in order to organize the data points. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. These old eyes are finding it hard to read. The labeled branch points of the tree V through Z represent various common ancestors. So they're telling you that V through Z represents a common ancestor. Now, they didn't say taxa, but we understand it's some kind of taxa. They didn't say the word species. Not sure what it is, but at some point there was this organism or a group of organisms that they identified as being a common ancestor to everything that came after that, because of common characteristics that these two, for instance, shared, that this one shared with these two, and that this is the common ancestor. Let's say that only since 50,000 years ago, there has been enough variation between lineages depicted here to separate them into distinct species. Only since 50,000 years ago have there been enough differences to call each of these a different species. Before then, they weren't considered different species. Let's say that only since 50,000 years ago, we're going to consider these different species. So we're looking at this dotted line here, right? 50,000 years ago. So after that, they were considered different species. All right. And only the tips of the lineages on this tree represent distinct species. All right, so only the tips. Now, they tell you that in the problem set, so there really shouldn't be a question that there's a distinct species here, there's a distinct species there, there's one here, there's a distinct species here, there's a distinct species there, and a distinct species there. You can number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, please understand that these species are still around. These two, what happened to them? Well, they're not here at present. They were there. Probably we know about them through fossils. What would you consider these two? I hope you said extinct, right? So let's go ahead and circle those in red for extinct. So 2 and 3 are extinct. They're gone. We only know them from their fossil evidence. 1, 4, 5, and 6 are still here. Now, they had a common ancestor that's also gone. So 1 and 2 share a common ancestor. 1, 2, and 3 share a common ancestor. 3, 4, 5, and 6 share one. And then 1 through 6 share one here. And even and this one also has one shared all the way back here. All right. So how many separate species, both extant, which means existing now. Extant means existing now. And extinct, which means they're not existing now. So these are existing now, and these are not existing now. Are depicted in this tree. 6, right? How many separate species, both extinct, are in this tree? Now, I gave you a clue. I said, remember, distinct species only started to be clearly identified less than 50,000 years ago in this example. 1 point for this. The answer is 6. And you see I highlighted there and put a star. And number 4 says, according to this tree, what percent of the species seem to be extant? In other words, that seem to still be around. And I gave you a clue here by saying not extant means not extinct. Clue extinct means that they're no longer here at present. All right. So present, we know there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? There's these 4. We're going to call present 1, 2, 3, and 4. Extant species that are no longer here, as we said, we're going to say it's 2 and 3 that are no longer here, as we discussed earlier. So out of a total of 6, you have 4 out of 6 are present. And 4 out of 6 is about 67%. So how many species are left? About 67%. The closest answer here is 66. So you go with 66. The next one says a tree's horizontal axis and timeline extends from 100,000 years ago to present. The vertical axis represents nothing in particular, as we've already read before. Which of the 5 common ancestors labeled Y or V through Z has given rise to the greatest number of species, both extant and extinct? Common ancestor has given rise to the most number of species, both extinct and presently here. Well, if it's from V through Z, then you'd have to say the one that's furthest back, which would be X. Suppose you could argue that Y has given rise to the same number of ancestors, since there is no difference in this puzzle, in this setup. There is no difference between the only species that we've been able to determine are here. But one must assume that there are many species throughout these timelines. And if there are, and given that this is probably another several thousand years, only 20,000 years, you'd expect that some other species had branched off and had become extinct. We just haven't identified them yet. You'd have to say that X would be the answer. And again, the same problem, same same puzzle here, same table. Which of the five common ancestors, again V through Z, has the least successful? It was the least successful in terms of percent of its derived species that are extant. In other words, the common ancestor, the least number of species that are still around. Well, this one is the most. It had 3 lineages come from it, and all 3 are still around. This one's at 50%. One went extinct. The other one is still around. This one here has 2 of the 3 are extinct. Where this one, 4 out of 6 are still around. 2 out of 3 extinct is the least successful. So W would be the least successful. So this common ancestor was the least successful. W was the least successful because of that. Even though V lost one of the lineages went extinct because of some environmental change that didn't allow it to keep going. But half of it did. Where here, only 1/3 made it because both of these lines ended up not being successful. The tree's horizontal axis and timeline, again, we're going to go ahead and continue this with problem 7. As we look at problem 7, it says, which of the 5 common ancestors labeled V through Z has the most successful in terms of, so now they want the most successful, not the least successful, and obviously that's going to be Y. Again, let's look at this. Which has the most successful in terms of the present of its derived species that are extant or still here. Particular answer would be wrong. It's labeled as Y. It's not Y. Why is it not Y? Let's look at it. Y would mean how many species were derived from this common ancestor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 were derived from Y. 2 went extinct. Only 4 are extant. Only 4 still exist at present day. So 4 out of 6. Again, that's 67%. But Z has 100% of its derived species still present. So Z has to be the most successful. So that's incorrect, and I will make that correction on the answer key. I don't know why some mistake happened and Y was chosen. Y is not the answer, but Z for that reason. All right, so let's take a look at the next question. It says, DDT was once considered the silver bullet that would permanently eradicate insect pests. Today, instead, DDT is largely useless against many insects. Which of these would have been required for this pest eradication effort to be successful in the long run? So let's think about it. Let's say you had a pest. There's a population here. Let's say they're fleas or mosquitoes. And there are some lakes or ponds nearby you. And each pond has a different set or population of mosquitoes living in it. And DDT kills the mosquitoes. So what would have to happen in order to make sure that this species, DDT, does not end up being useless? Well, how is it that that DDT becomes useless? If DDT kills mosquitoes, then how is it possible that mosquitoes then become resistant to DDT? Well, some must have survived. There must have been an amount of DDT that was used. There must have been exposure to the DDT, to the mosquitoes, to a concentration that wasn't deadly to all of them. So you have to kill all of them in order to get rid of all the mosquitoes. If even one or two, or well, you're not one pregnant one, I suppose, but a bunch of just a few of these millions and millions of mosquitoes survive, then they can become resistant over time. They can evolve. They might have a mutation. Maybe, let's consider this, that maybe one of these, maybe one in this population here, maybe one in this population here, are resistant to DDT. If given in a high enough concentration, that population would, that mosquito would die. But if you don't give it a high enough concentration, then that mosquito survives and is able to have progeny. And that mutation then goes on, and the next generation becomes even more resistant. The next generations after that become even more resistant as they spread and become resistant to your insecticide, which is what DDT is. So they could have given. There's several things that needed to happen. First of all habitats should have received application of DDT at about the same time. So you got to get rid of all the mosquitoes all at the same time, which actually is not the answer. So that was not the answer. Larger doses should have been applied. And if they would have applied a larger dose to wherever they gave the DDT to the mosquitoes, then the mosquitoes would have perished. All of them would have perished. But because the dose was low enough that some of them survived, those individuals were resistant to DDT. All the others died. It was high enough to kill most of the mosquitoes, but not all of them. That allowed those that had whatever that mutation is, that allowed them to be resistant to the insecticide to continue. And as time went on, various other mutations occurred and made them even more resistant. Now, there is another good answer. And again, we have to pick the best answer here. And what the problem is with this particular answer choice is that it would be a good idea that all the habitats, if you want to make sure that DDT stays effective, you'd want to kill all the mosquitoes in all the habitats at once. You'd want to make sure that the DDT receives the highest possible dose in order to kill all the mosquitoes. The frequency of the application might be an influence as well. These are not the best answers, but they're certainly not bad ideas. Now, the problem with having too many applications, the problem with having the concentration too strong is that you start to overdose the drug on other species that live in those ponds. So you start to kill the fish, or humans start to get sick once you get to a certain dose, because remember, dosing is an important characteristic of any drug, any poison. All drugs are poison at some dose. All things can be poisonous at a high enough dose. So you have to be careful how you dose, how high a concentration that you commit to an environment. So none of the individual insects should have possessed genomes that made them resistant to DDT. So in order for this to have been successful, fundamentally, this is the answer. You had to have none of these individuals be resistant to DDT. If even one, as I said, one or two are resistant, then it's going to be difficult for this DDT to really stay effective. Over time, we have found that I'm going to go ahead and say this, although I'm sure someone will find some exception. Given enough time, all the insecticides we use, insects have become immune to them, or at least resistant to them. So we have to use such a high dose of insecticide that it makes the food supply not usable, or kills fish or humans, and so we can't really use it. And a continual application, again, there's another problem with a continual application, which is the same problem that you have with having too much or applying it to all habitats at once. It becomes hard to do, and it also starts to impact other species, including humans. So the best answer is that you have to find a poison that the creatures, none of the creatures have a genetic mutation that allows them to be resistant to that poison. And we've never found any drug, any poison that kills insects and continues to kill them forever, because insects eventually evolve, as that is what life does. Life evolves to overcome the environment, because individuals are born with mutations that allow them to adapt to that environment. And we see it with antibiotic resistant organisms. When we have tuberculosis, we had drugs like penicillin that worked against these bacteria. But given enough time and overuse of the drug, by the way, and incomplete use so that you allow some of them to survive. See, the idea that you have to have a high enough dose for a long enough time to kill all of them, because if you even have one survive with resistance, that one could then mutate again and become even more resistant, until today we have many bacteria that our antibiotics do not work. We have no antibiotics that can kill them. And it's basically the same idea. If you allow this idea of drugs or poisons killing a specific bug, whether it be an insect or a bacteria, only works for a limited amount of time. Even now with this COVID-19, if we come up with a vaccine for this virus, it would work. It would work to some degree of success, but it would only work for that virus now. Over time, that virus will have mutations that will change it, and then we'll have to come up with another vaccine. That's why you have to get vaccinated for the flu every year, because the flu mutates. The population, as time goes on, mutations accrue, and you have a new species or a new strain that is resistant to the antibiotic, that your immune system is no longer reacting to, and so it ends up making you sick, even though you've gotten a vaccination for it, because it's changed. It's changed its outer coating. The protein coat, for instance, changes. So when you're talking about these mutations that we've talked about over these 6 weeks, it's collecting all these mutations over time allow individuals in a population to adapt to an environment that includes insects, that includes bacteria, that includes viruses. Viruses do evolve, they do mutate. It's difficult to say. Some people argue they're alive, others argue they're not. But in any case, that virus does change over time. It does evolve and does become resistant to our immune system. And it becomes more and more difficult to fight against these. We have to continuously come up with new and better ways of attacking them. And sometimes that means using an old drug or a different drug or a new drug. We have to look for them in the environment. And the best way to look for these new ways of attacking these bugs is to look at how nature deals with them. Remember that our first antibiotics came from fungi. It was a fungus that gave us our first antibiotic, the first drug that killed the bacteria and allowed us to fight infectious disease. And it is nature where we're going to find these answers. If we destroy our environments, we kill all the bacteria, we kill all the fungi, it's going to be difficult for us to come up with new and better ways of addressing these diseases, these contagious diseases that continuously attack. And as they evolve, we have to change. If we don't change, then we won't survive. That is what evolution's all about. as individuals adapt to an environment, those that don't adapt don't survive. Change will happen. There will be a change in the environment. You have to adapt or you won't survive. So some members of photosynthetic plant species are genetically resistant to an herbicide. Here again, you have this plant. There's an herbicide is a drug that kills herbs. Herbs, another word for plant, right? So herbicides are chemicals that kill plants. You might call them weed killers. But remember, weed killers kill weeds. Generally, they don't kill the plants we like. However, they're targeted plant killers. Some herbicides they kill all plants. So some members of photosynthetic plant species are genetically resistant to an herbicide, while other members of the same species are not resistant. So just like the insects that we just talked about, you have these populations of plants where you have some that are resistant and some that are not. So the resistant ones are green. They'll survive if you give them, if you apply the chemical that kills plants, while the others of the same species, they don't have that mutation that allows them to survive if you apply the herbicide. So while other members of the same species are not resistant to herbicide, which combination of events should cause the most effective replacement of the non-herbicide resistant strain, the one that's not resistant to the herbicide? How do you replace the reds with the greens, right? How do you replace the ones that are not resistant in the population with those that are resistant in the population? How do you get rid of those that are not resistant to the herbicide? Well, I hope you say that you have to apply the herbicide. If you apply the herbicide, those that are not resistant will die. Those that are resistant will survive. Well, so how do you do that? The question is, how do you get that most effective way of replacing those non-herbicide resistant strain by plants that are resistant? Well, hopefully you say you have to have the presence of the herbicide in the environment. Absence of the herbicide in the environment would allow those that are not resistant to survive, so you can't get rid of them. If you apply the herbicide, then those in red die, marked by an X here. Then the only ones that are left are going to be those that are green, those that are resistant. And see, that's what happens is in a population, you have to have that mixture of genes that you have, or that genetic diversity, that when the environment changes, when the herbicide is added to the population, some survive while those that are not resistant die. Maintenance of the proper conditions for one generation. So you have to keep this going on for at least a generation so that the generation dies off. They can't. You only need one generation, right? Is after one generation they should be gone. But wait a minute. What if the resistance to the herbicide is recessive? What if the resistance is recessive? That means that some of these that are resistant, dominant. What if it's dominant? That means that the non-resistance gene is out there. And so some of these greens can come together and have babies that are not resistant to the herbicide. So if you want to completely get rid of those plants that are not resistant to the herbicide, you have to do it for more than one generation, so that you can make sure that if resistance is dominant and non-resistance is recessive, you can get rid of even those that are recessive. Even those individuals, get rid of all the genes that are not resistant to the herbicide. So you need to do both of these. All right. Now, what do I mean? I just want to make sure you understand. This is, again, an application of what we've been talking about. If resistance is dominant, big R, you have a resistant plant, it could be big R, little r, or it could be big R, big R. The big R genes, plants, they're going to have resistance just like the big R, little r ones are. So just because they're resistant to the herbicide does not mean that its children, its progeny, will be able to be resistant to that herbicide. If this is big R, little r, and this one's big R, little r, they're resistant. They survived that first generation with the herbicide applied. Their progeny could give you a little r. In fact, 1/4, right? If you have a population and you have big R, little r crossed with a big R, little r, by now you should be able to tell me that 1/4 will be homozygous dominant, 1/4 will be heterozygous dominant. So all three of these here will be resistant, but you're going to have 1/4 of the population that's not going to be resistant at that point. And that's your problem. Now, if you do this for numerous generations, eventually you'll be able to get rid of the little r in the population, or make it so low that you won't see it pop up. You'll see it pop up rarely. So you have to keep it up for many generations to get rid of all the little r's in the population. All right, so we look at 3TC resistant HIV. So this is HIV is a virus. It's infected humans over time. Let's take a look at this. The graph figure 22.3, which depicts, let's get rid of these here. Let's look at that here. I think is this the one? Yeah, 22.3. And we're looking at question is it? Question 10, right? So we're looking at 10. That's 14. Here we go. We're about halfway done. Sorry it's taking so long, but I want to make sure I go over all these answers in case you need to cover them. You need some of these you can skip through and others you can focus on, depending on your need. So here's time, and the graph depicts 4 possible patterns of abundance of 3TC resistant HIV within an infected human over time. So there's 4 different types of 3TC resistant HIV. Over time, one drops quickly, another one rises. This one rises at a kind of even exponential growth here. This one has a little bit of exponential growth, then kind of goes down to some kind of limit. So let's go ahead and look at what the question is. If 3TC, so this 3TC is, these HIVs are 3TC resistant, so 3TC you would expect would be some kind of drug, right? If 3TC administration begins at the time indicated, and the time indicated would be by the arrow. There's the arrow. This is when they start to administer 3TC. Now, they tell you in the problem that 3TC resistance is costly for HIV. So in order for it to be resistant, it has to express something, and maybe it can produce less of itself, or it can reproduce slower. It makes itself vulnerable by it. Whatever the case may be, it's costly to it in some way. So it doesn't want to have that 3TC resistance gene on all the time. So if you start would you expect it to be on, and then all of a sudden when you administer 3TC, that 3TC starts to get turned off? Would you expect it to get turned on and then start slowing down and stop? Or would you expect it to start turning on and continuously turn on? Right? Until, as time goes on, just continuously produces 3TC resistant. If it's costly, you'd expect it to have virtually none of them have 3TC resistance at first, but then as time goes on, you'd expect it to continuously grow in its amount of 3TC being produced until all of them, 100% of them, have 3TC resistance expressed. And so you'd expect 3 to be the curve you'd follow. That was a real tough question. If you didn't get it right away, that's fine. If you still don't understand it, honestly, it's a tough one. But 3TC, what you'd expect is that since it's so costly to HIV to make, it would not make that protein. And therefore, the population start making it only after you introduce the drug. And once it starts to make it, you'd expect it to slow down after a certain point as 100% of the population is expressing it. There'd be no reason to continue it. All right. Of the following anatomical structures, which is homologous to the wing of a bird? Homologous, remember, means that the individual the structure is similar. It has something genetically related. It has the same body plan, or it has the same number of bones or relative shapes, but they use it in a different way. Maybe the bones got longer, but they're the same number of bones. Maybe they've inherited it from a common ancestor, but they've changed it in such a way that they're now different species. So we're talking about a bird. The dorsal fin of a shark. Dorsal fins on sharks. First of all, sharks are non-bony. Secondly, the dorsal fin is a cartilage that's on the back of the dorsal means back of the shark. The wings of a bird are on its side. So you would not expect that the dorsal, that would be the least likely answer if I were doing this multiple choice so far. The hind limb of a kangaroo. So if these two, a kangaroo and a bird, had some common ancestor, what would the wings of the bird be homologous to? What would have changed to become wings from all the species since the common ancestor? If it was the hind legs, then the bird wouldn't have legs. But we know every bird I've ever seen has legs. With those, you see those little tracks that birds leave on the ground. They all have rear legs. Hind means rear. They all have rear legs. So it's actually their forearms, right? Their arms, the forelimbs, right? Not the hind limbs, but their forelimbs that would be analogous to the bird, not the hind limb. So again, I'm going to go ahead and disqualify that as an answer from my answer choices. The wings of a butterfly are not bone. They're made of dried exoskeleton. They're leathery when they're first made. They unwrap, dry, and then they float away or fly away. So even though they're both wings, they're analogous. The two wings are analogous in that they use for the same purpose, but they have different evolutionary sources. They've evolved flight, ability to fly, in two different ways. They didn't evolve from a common ancestor. Tail fin of a flying fish. Now that's really tricky because you think flying fish and bird is flying. Well, they must be. Those are the two I'm going to link together. Well, it's sort of a trick. First of all, the flying fish don't really fly. They do have little leathery flaps that when they swim in really quickly and they jump out of the water and they open up their fins and that are on their side, and that opens them up and they glide. It's more of a glide than it is a fly. More like a flying squirrel, for instance. Flying squirrels don't actually fly. They have leathery connections between their arms and their body, and when they jump out of a tree, they open them up and they sail down from one branch to the next. They can't really fly like a bat or a bird. So, and then the other trick part of this is it says tail fin. Again, that's in the rear, like dorsal fin. The tail fins are in the rear. Again, that would be more, wings are in the front, are the two appendages on the front, not the back. The flipper of a cetacean, so dolphins, right? Flippers on dolphins are like the arms on a human or the wings on a bird. They have the same number of bones, and if you look back at the videos we discussed, I actually made that analogy, and we looked at the bone structures and compared the evolutionary relationship between humans, fish, and dolphins. So the answer is E, and that's the one I would choose if I were taking this with you. All right. Over evolutionary time, many cave-dwelling organisms have lost their eyes. Now, that makes sense, right? If you're living in a cave, there's no light. Why would you need eyes? You wouldn't. And it takes a lot of energy to develop eyes. Those that were born without eyes and that had different sensory organs that could survive better in caves. And over millennia, those with eyes were lost. They didn't survive. They weren't best fit to survive. Those that had developed other ways of surviving did, and they have taken over the populations underground. Tapeworms have lost their digestive system. They don't have a digestive system, but tapeworms don't need it, do they? Because you digest food for them. If you get a tapeworm, you digest the food and it eats what you've digested for them. They don't need acids and enzymes to break down food. You break it down for them. They just absorb it and get bigger. By the way, they don't take all your food, so they get bigger in your intestines and live with you. So they end up they'll get you, you'll end up being malnourished over time, but only after you have many, many tapeworms in your intestines. It's kind of gross, actually. Whales have lost their hind limbs. Well, that makes sense. So all three of these, the cave-dwelling organisms losing their eyes, the tapeworms losing the thing they don't need, the digestive system. Whales don't need hind limbs, and we've looked at that evolutionary change, that vestigial structure in whales, that they still have leg bones, even though they don't need legs. How can natural selection account for these losses? Well, let's look at, remember what natural selection is. Natural selection is the environment changes, and those that are better adapted, those that have mutations that are better adapted to that environment, survive. All right, so natural selection cannot account for losses only for innovations. Well, that's not true. Since the whole point of natural selection is some die and some live, death is certainly one of the things that natural selection imposes. It's one of the tools that impacts natural selection. Natural selection accounts for these losses by the principle of use and disuse. Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by that, but we're going to go ahead and just continue. I'm assuming they mean that if you use it, you lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it, kind of thing. It's kind of, I mean, that is true. If you're in a wheelchair, often people in the wheelchair will lose muscle mass in their legs because they're not using their legs. Same with people without can't move their arms, will lose muscle mass in their arms. But they don't lose their arms completely. Their bone mass might become less dense, but they don't lose it completely. They don't absorb their arms and, I don't know, develop flippers. That's not what's going to happen. But if you don't use it, you do end up spending less energy on it and less resources on it. That just makes sense. But that really doesn't have to do with natural selection. Natural selection, remember, is that whatever mutation you have that gives you an advantage, you're going to be able to produce more babies. And so in the next generation, you're going to see more of those genes, more of those characteristics in the next generation. So in the case of whales, those that had that didn't have legs, that had instead a tail fin and two flippers, they did much better at swimming and could go get more food and had more babies, and so they survived. And their bones, or their hind legs, became less and less important, and they became smaller and smaller as the mutations occurred to make them that small. Under particular circumstances, they persisted for long periods. Each of these structures presented greater costs than benefits. So at some point, having hind legs didn't allow certain individuals or certain parts of the population to survive as well. Having hind legs maybe got in the way of swimming, made them more tired, could allow them to resisted the flow, the movement through the water. So the cost became more than the benefit of having. The ancestors of these organisms experienced harmful mutations that forced them to find new habitats, and these species had not previously used. That just doesn't really make too much sense. And we can go into the details on that, but I'm just going to say, for time's sake, since we're already at 51 minutes, that under particular circumstances, they persisted in long periods of time. So you had a long period of time where you had these individuals with hind legs, but these structures came at a cost. So having eyes got in the way of maybe more bumps that allowed for the naked mole rat. So it's just blind. Naked mole rat, I believe, is blind. It has whiskers, and maybe the eyes were getting in the way of the nerves that were dedicated to the eye, could now be dedicated to whiskers or feelers that allow it to sense where it is underground without light. So those that had that other mutation survived. Those that had the nerves going to the eye didn't survive as well. And those that were blind ended up being those that survived. The same with tapeworms, the same with whales. So C is the answer. Which of the following pieces of evidence most strongly supports the common origin of all life on Earth? All organisms use essentially the same genetic code. And that's just outstanding point there. And I've said that, and I believe I said that directly in the previous videos. All organisms require energy. I hope you understand that everything requires energy to happen. Anything that moves, a rock rolling down a hill requires energy. A pendulum requires energy. All organisms reproduce. Well, that's true. In all organisms requiring energy is true. But how does that connect all organisms together? Right? All organisms show heritable variation. Right? Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean that they all inherited from the same individuals, right? Although all this is part of the evidence, it's the most strongly supports it. All organisms have undergone evolution. Again, yes, it's true, and that helps us understand that all life on Earth has common characteristics. That's true. But what's interesting is that the stuff that's inherited, the stuff that you actually pass on from sperm to egg, right, in mitosis, and then later in meiosis, and then during sex, they recombine and rearrange. It's that genetic code. And that genetic code is the same for everything on Earth. That transcription and translation is the same on everything on Earth. And not only is that the same, but virtually all life on Earth uses the same universal code for producing proteins. They produce them in the same way. That suggests that there's some commonality, there's some connection, some deep connection. So that's really the strongest piece of evidence of these 5. Which of the following statements most detracts from the claim that the human appendix is a completely vestigial organ? Completely vestigial. Remember, vestigial means that for the most part, the structure is no longer useful. But they're saying the word completely vestigial, so it's absolutely not useful. So that would mean, again, they even give you a clarification. Actually, I think I wrote this. Remember, these tests come from various standardized exams. And they write, I wrote you a clue saying, remember, the vestigial could mean is a small function or has no function. In this case, they want to know evidence that is there that it does not have any function of any sort, right? Completely vestigial. Which one of these detracts? So that means not, which takes away from the idea that that is absolutely vestigial, takes away, which contradicts it. Now, I'm going to tell you that this is just one of the many examples of these questions where they give you questions that are double negatives. Did you notice that? Did you notice that the hardest questions in this question set are the questions where they give you this, which one of these does not, right? So they say which one of the most statements most detracts from the claim that the appendix is completely vestigial. So which one of these takes away from the argument that it is not? Takes away is not. So that double negative argument is often the most difficult questions to answer. So you got to keep it straight, diagramming it, writing it down, thinking about it. So in this case, they want to know, again, what evidence is there that it does not have any function of any sort? That what evidence is there that it has function, right? Which one detracts? So detracts from that argument. All right. The appendix can be surgically removed and have no immediate ill effect. Well, that just kind of goes with the idea. So it supports it being vestigial, but they want to know which one detracts from that argument, so it's not it. You see what I just did? This is true, and it supports it being completely vestigial, but they want to know detracts, right? The appendix might have been larger in fossil hominids. Well, that just means it was larger and more prominent, and it really doesn't detract or support. So I can just get rid of that one since it really doesn't help detract. But it might be the answer. I'm not committing to an answer yet. The next C says the appendix has a substantial amount of digestive lymphatic tissue or defensive lymphatic tissue. That's a function. That detracts. Certainly detracts more than A and B. So I'm going to say that's my best answer thus far. Next, individuals with larger than average appendix leave fewer offspring. Well, that just means that it's getting in the way. That means it's having a larger appendix is making you less fit to survive. So that would mean that the next population probably has more people with smaller appendixes. In 1 million years, the human species might completely lack an appendix, which means it's not useful. It's not that important. So the only one that really detracts from it being a completely vestigial organ, that argument is C. Okay, almost done here. Sorry, guys, it's taking this long. But again, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. Just kind of skip through it. Pick the questions that confused you. Given Earth's history, do you think there will ever be another supercontinent like Pangaea? Given the fact that, think about the history that we talked about, right? Think about it. And you know that the continents, that the convection currents are still moving the continents. We still have earthquakes in Los Angeles. There's still mountains growing in India. There's still volcanoes in the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii still has an active volcano over its hotspot. So do you think that these continents, as they keep moving, will collide again and become one giant supercontinent? Sure, eventually they will. When? I don't know. I'm sure somebody's predicted it. But in a few million years, there'll be another supercontinent, whatever that's going to look like. So the answer is yes. And why? Because convection currents are still turning. Why? Because movement of the supercontinents will force them, or movement of the continents will force them all to run into each other again, since we are a sphere and there's limited places that they can move. As they move, they will collide again. So the answer is yes. And I answered why verbally. I hope I don't have to write it all down for you. Describe the plate motions along the Himalayan mountains. Do you think these mountains are getting larger, smaller, or staying the same? Explain your answer. Well, if you look at the plate movements in the Himalayan mountains, one continent is moving in this direction, another continent is moving in that direction. Now, unlike the subduction zones, these two are both continental crusts, so they're both fairly not dense, right? Fairly light, if you will. So as they collide, what I want you to do, if you're not understanding my explanation as I go through the rest of this, take two pieces of paper in front of you, lay it flat on a table, and slowly push them on towards each other. What you're going to see is the two pieces of paper are going to move up and do this to each other. They're going to form a peak. And that's what's going to happen with two continents that are the same density. Remember in the explanation I gave you in the video, the subduction zone, the reason the Atlantic Ocean, for instance, is not getting any bigger, is because this continental plate of the North American plate, which is a continental plate, is being hit by oceanic plate, which is the Atlantic plate, right? The oceanic plate hits it. This is again a place of collision, but this plate is more dense. This one is less dense. So the less dense one floats, while the more dense one sinks. So you get this matter going down underneath, and what you get are volcanoes. We call this a subduction zone. Again, where one plate moves underneath the less dense plate. Here in the Himalayas, both plates are continental. So when they bump into each other, the two are going to lift and they're going to mountain build. So this is called a convergence zone, convergence, coming together. This convergence zone is going to mountain build. It's going to build the mountain. The mountains are getting higher. Why? Because they're both the same density, and just like those two pieces of paper I just told you to push together on your plate, on your table, they're going to push together and push each other up. And that explains why. Because they have the same density. When they collide, they push each other up and they build mountains. All right. So that checks off that essay question. A caption for this map. They want you to come up with a caption for this map. And they say, what is happening at the boundaries? The arrows indicate plate movement direction. So let's take a look at the map. So they want a caption for this map. Well, we could call it what a lot of people call it, the north, you say plates colliding. And the caption, that might be the title of your little graphic. But you can see that the North American plate and the Pacific plate are colliding. So we would call that, a convergence zone. And at this convergence zone, the North American plate is mostly continental. The Pacific plate is mostly oceanic. So you have a lot more weight on the Pacific plate than you do on a North American plate. And so the North American plate is a lot less dense. And what's happening there is volcanoes you have a collision zone and you have volcanoes being produced. You might have some subduction. You might have mountain building. In this case, you probably have mountain building here, right? There'd be volcanoes all throughout here. Here you'd have the Pacific plate going underneath the North American plate, and you'd have volcanoes, again, erupting all along here. And in fact, we do have volcanoes here. There's several mountains that are volcanoes here in Alaska. This is Alaska. So anything that you write that explains what I just said, that this is a convergence zone, that you have volcanoes forming along this convergence zone, that you could have subduction here on the continental part of the plate, the North American plate, that these two here could be building ridges or mountains along this collision zone, that volcanoes are going to erupt throughout this entire zone, and in fact they do all the time. Any of those facts should be listed in your caption. All right. The oldest rocks in the ocean are near the mid-ocean ridges. Well, if you remember the description of what's going on at the mid-ocean ridges are where new rock is being formed. The oldest ones are to the east and the west of the mid-Atlantic ridge, because the whole point of telling you the history of that is to let you know that you have this ridge where the two plates, this plate is moving in this direction, and this plate's moving in that direction, leaving a gap. That gap is filled by magma as the convection currents turn. This is new rock being formed here. And the example that we talked about, and you can go back and look at it, is the north and south flipping every so often along these areas as new rock is made, and the magnetic fields switch on each side of the mid-Atlantic ridge. You have matching but alternating magnetic rocks with alternating magnetic orientation. And then at the very end, when they hit, right before they hit the continent, because remember, the continental plate, as we described here, is a subduction zone, is the Atlantic plate here and along the United States, all from north and south, all the way through South America. Is this plate, well, at least the North American plate, as this plate hits the North American plate, this subducts and gets melted, becomes part of the rock cycle. So the oldest rock is actually in North American. The North American plate has much older rock. The bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is all fairly new rock. So near the middle of the North Atlantic ridge is actually new rock, not old. So that's false. The answer is false. Continental crust is less dense than oceanic crust. Is less dense. That's true. That's why it floats over the oceanic crust. Continents are younger than the ocean basins. That's false. I just said it. The ocean basins are younger. The continental crust is older. Since oceanic crust is continuously being produced, the size of the Earth is increasing. That's false because the oceanic crust is so dense, it subducts. It goes underneath and gets melted and becomes part of the Earth's liquid, or I should say not solid, magma. Fluid magma. Iceland is located upon the East Pacific Ridge. The Pacific Ridge is on the opposite side. It's the Atlantic Ridge. It's actually it's in the Atlantic. Iceland is actually where the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Mid-Atlantic Rift actually comes out of the ocean. It's actually, you can see it. That's why there's so many volcanoes on Iceland, because they're literally, the land in Iceland is being split in half, and the magma from underneath the earth is coming up and forming new land. And the island of Hawaii experiences volcanoes because it's located on a hotspot. That's true. The island of Hawaii is over a hotspot, and what that means is that as there's this plume of extremely hot magma, this constantly like a blowtorch blowing on a spot, and that it doesn't move. But over that hot spot, hence the term, is the oceanic plate, the bottom of the Pacific plate. And as this burns a hole through that plate, it burns a hole through it and creates volcanoes, and the magma comes out and touches the water, cools off, and makes land, makes an island. That island grows into a Hawaii. But as the Pacific plate moves, it continues to move. The hot spot doesn't. And as the Pacific plate moves, new land, new part of the continents are on top of that really super hot flame, and it melts a hole through the Pacific plate and grows new land. The older islands, which moved down the road, which moved over past the plume, right, past the hot spot. As it rains and erosion and weathering and erosion happen, the island becomes smaller. The island that's over the hotspot is growing bigger. So you have the big island of Hawaii, you have the smaller islands of Hawaii. There's a whole chain of islands. Hawaii is actually a chain of islands. And that chain of islands is over the biggest one is over a hotspot and is continuously growing. Eventually, in a million years, or a few 100,000 years, a million years, a new one will form that will be just as large or even larger, and it'll continue to move along, and the older islands will become smaller and smaller until they've gone back into the sea. So this chain of islands is created because the continental crust, which is I should represent it here in brown, gets melted, and as it melts, it breaks through the crust and starts to form land in the ocean. And that land, from the very bottom from the top of the continental crust through the ocean, is what we call the Hawaiian Islands. But because they move over, there's no more new land being built. Weathering erosion happens, and the older islands become smaller and smaller. The younger ones are bigger and bigger, till you have the biggest and the smallest, and there's a long chain of these islands. And that's because this plate is continuously moving towards the east, the northeast, away from California, and the chain just keeps moving along with it. Now, Hawaii will pretty much always be where Hawaii is, because even though this island, the land that was Hawaii, will eventually go back into the ocean. The new Hawaii will be wherever the hotspot is next, which is where it always has been. The hotspot doesn't move. There are different hotspots and maybe eventually it will move. I don't know. But as far as we know, this is the way Hawaii has worked for millions of years. So the answer for Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, is true. This answer is also true. All right. Periodically, the Earth's magnetic field reverses. Well, I hope that you know that that's true. I've said that. In fact, I just described it a minute ago. There's a whole video on it. So you should know that that's true. In fact, we think we're going through a reversal now. Alfred Wegener used several lines of evidence to support his continental drift hypothesis, including glaciation, continental fit, the puzzles fitting together on the atlas, and fossils, and that's absolutely true. And a major criticism of the continental drift hypothesis was the apparent lack of driving mechanisms. Yes, because remember, they didn't know about convection currents in the magma of the Earth, right? Underneath the crust of the Earth that were moving these. Nobody could figure out, nobody could even imagine how there could be anything big enough to move an entire continent, the land underneath the entire ocean, move these plates around. The idea was ridiculous to them. But today we know it's true, and we can actually measure it, and we can see it, and we can see the measurements and measure the energy and predict a lot of these movements, at least in generalities. So we know that this continental drift concept is a reality, and we're pretty sure with all the evidence that Pangaea and Gondwana land and etc. have existed, and we're pretty sure that new supercontinents will form given enough time, and we're pretty sure that these hotspots exist, and we're pretty sure that this world geography, the way the world moves and the timing of it, remember, we can actually measure it almost to the clock, almost use it as a clock. For instance, we know we have on the west coast the movement along the San Andreas Faults about, I don't remember the exact numbers, something like 3 inches or 3 centimeters a year. We know that. Pretty consistent, given enough time, you can measure these things. And because of that, we know, relatively speaking, how old the Earth is, and because of radiometric dating, because of absolute dating, remember absolute dating and relativistic dating, we're pretty sure how old the Earth is. We're pretty sure we understand in generalities, not all the specifics. Obviously, studies still going on. Obviously, people are still figuring things out and discovering new things. However, there's a lot we know, a lot of information that's out there. Hopefully you understand a little about what we understand about the geography of the planet, why we think evolution is a reality. Whether you believe humans evolved or not is irrelevant, or whether you believe evolution is a concept that is palatable to you or not, again, is really not the point. The point is that there is a lot of evidence supporting it, that scientifically it is an accepted concept and a theory that explains some realities. And I think we've gone over in detail what those realities are. So the next part of the unit, what we're going to try to do is talk about how what the mechanisms are for evolution. What is it? How does evolution actually work? How does the theory of evolution work? We spent this entire unit kind of looking at the evidence that's supporting it, all the different lines of research that point to all this being the case. Now we're going to look at how the theory is applied, how we use it to explain, and how we can explain what happens, why it happens, and how it happens. Again, just to emphasize that none of this is you're not required to believe anything. Belief is something outside of the science classroom. What you need to do is understand the theory and be able to apply it. After that, you can take what you will. Hopefully, as long as you understand it, you can make whatever arguments you want against it, but understand it first before you try to make arguments. All right, have a good one.